running through my mind all day, waiting for her show to play. Turn your radio on, she's gonna play your favorite song.
Hi, I am Brandi Richard Thompson, and this is Operation Growth. Here we will examine how to grow through what you go through. Let's grow together. Last week on Operation Growth, we discussed the hero's journey and the importance of reviewing your own story for patterns and opportunities to change. The American Historical Association says that history helps us understand people and societies, and that history helps us understand change and how the society we live in came to be. With 7 continents and billions of people on the earth, our history is massive. Exploring one civilization could take a lifetime. And so, even though there's so much out there, it's extremely important that we know as much as we can about the community in which we live, especially the community we call home. Growing up in the South, I was connected to family members and places that I love. My grandmother's home and its close position to everything that made our lives special was so valuable and important to me. The food we ate, the church where we worshiped, the place where we eulogized our dead and where we buried them, the corner store and my mother's school were all within a mile or two of each other. Back then, I assumed that was still walking distance. Relatives lived across the street and the next block over. This community that I called home was special for me. And to this day, if I am in the neighborhood, I will drive by for some food or a site that brings me a piece of that feeling of home. As I grew up and went to school there, the history of that portion of my city was never mentioned. No one spoke of how it became the hub for Black people or how my grandmother, great-grandmother, great-great-grandmother ended up with a home there. I didn't know to ask anybody, so I moved away. But if anyone asked me about my home, the place I truly felt at home, I would say proudly, Southern Louisiana. That's my home. I'm from Baton Rouge. Many years later, I started to do some research on my home. And by then, my grandmother and great-grandmother were no longer there to answer questions for me. And as I researched, I found maps and property records that helped me to start to understand why my great-grandmother lived there and her mother before her. And just the small snippet of information I was able to tease out of the history shows the duality of my hometown. We lived where homes were being sold to Black people. We lived in the shadow of a large forced labor camp, which some of you now call plantations, that produced sugar and shipped it all along the Mississippi River. We lived and worked near a huge oil plant where we were able to make a living. And when I speak of we, I am speaking of ancestors, people all throughout my family line who came from this area of Louisiana. We lived in our neighborhood because we weren't allowed to live in other parts of the city when my great-great-grandmother purchased her home. And even later, there were restrictions for my great-grandmother and my grandmother for where they could live. But not just we, my family necessarily. We included the people who look like me, the people in my family, but also Black people. And so we made that place our own. All the joy and love that I felt in Baton Rouge was real. However, it was built on land that had seen great pain and hardship. So what I identified with and loved about my hometown may not really have been Southern Louisiana. It may have been that community. But it was hard to distinguish as I looked at everything that made my home unique. the history and her story that defined that area. I realized the genteel Southern society that was also part of my identification with the South was born of parts of the culture that caused me great shame and my ancestors great harm. Yet it was all balled up together. The definition of a Southern lady who is Black and a Southern lady who is white can be so similar in our decision not to speak about indelicate truths. The great cooking and hospitality and effortless beauty I learned was born of my ancestors' ingenuity and forced hard work. That we didn't necessarily get to enjoy that great cooking and hospitality and effortless beauty as we toiled to produce it for others. There was so much to unpack about what that meant to my story and what I told myself about myself as a Southern girl from Louisiana. The uncertainty of my kind of Southern was always there, just under the surface. It showed up every time I wanted fragile Southern belle, my tears mean something treatment, and instead received Black superwoman, you can do it all by yourself, wipe your tears and move on treatment. It wasn't until I began to research my history that I understood my own feelings. The search for my history actually took on its own hero's journey in my life. There were evil people, or at least people who were blocking me at the library, asking me why I wanted to pull up that old information. She didn't want me to get all excited about what happened back then and potentially go out into the streets and protest or behave in a way that she didn't think made sense for whatever I would feel when I saw the documents. She clearly did not want me to see. And so there were also other people along this journey, people at the courthouse who charged me for property records of my own people. Made me kind of hot. They didn't even accept credit cards, cash only. The microfilm and navigating all the locations where the documents were held was challenging as well. So I was definitely on a journey. However, more importantly, I was learning to accurately understand my place in my hometown and even in the larger world, just by learning my own history. My history opened the door to understand the history of others around me, and slowly the picture of my life began to come into focus. Part of my journey was understanding how important history is in our own lives. Sometimes the history we have been told or was passed down to us isn't accurate. Sometimes it's just out and out wrong. And sometimes our history shapes who we are in a way that we don't even see because we're just acting on it and living in it moment by moment without thinking about its impact on our lives. And so history is so important, and getting it right, that the accurate history for yourself is so important, because whether or not you're living in some fantasy land of what your history is, or whether you're living clearly in the present of what that history is, your DNA knows, your body knows if you're false or not. And it causes you to not really be true to yourself. So you put up defense mechanisms and you say things that make no sense for who you really are. And what I learned throughout my history research is that so many of us, our lives are intertwined, especially here in the United States and of course across the world. We are not one anything. We're a combination of a lot of things. And as we talk about our history as from the perspective of this one part of who we are, we neglect the rest of it. We neglect the other parts of who we are that made us and allowed us to be here to do what we're doing today. And so your history, and as we spoke last week, your personal hero's journey is extremely important in who you are and who you present yourself to the world as. History also helps us to understand the world through our morals or our lens of right and wrong. And so, regardless of if it was your ancestor or your forefather who did something ridiculous, I did some research on my great great grandmother and found her in the newspaper a couple of times being drunk. I don't know what that means. I'm not going to make any stories about what that could potentially mean, but it's a piece of a puzzle that I will start to put together. But one negative action, one instance of her being drunk in a public place does not negate her contribution to my life and the fact that I'm here today and her strength and resilience that allowed me to be here today. But knowing that may make me not drink or make me feel like maybe that's something that's in my heritage that I should be careful of. All kinds of ways that you can look at the information that's presented from your history, but not to know, to hide from it, just because morally it's challenging to look at a negative history, what you perceive as negative, or positive history, what you perceive as positive, is just not how we should go about living our lives. And so because history helps us to understand the world through a lens of right and wrong, whether it's your ancestor or other ancestors, you can start to see the same types of patterns that you would see in your own story and determine how we as a nation, as a community, as a city like Baton Rouge need to rectify that. And so that's another way that history is extremely important and necessary in our own growth. History gives us identity. And so much of my identity had been caught up in being from the South, being from Louisiana, being from Southern Louisiana, potentially having some Creole roots and Creole cooking in my background, which for those of you who don't know, the term Creole is really just a definition of having a mixture of people. So whereas we look at people and see them as Creole and think, oh, they need to look this way or speak this way, that term actually means a blending of races, cultures, et cetera, in one person. So if your mother was white and your father was Black, then you were Creole. If your mother was Spanish and your father was Native American, you were Creole. And that beautiful blending or Creole-ness of Southern Louisiana makes something totally new and different and gives people who live there a certain identity, an identity that they take on and feel, and an identity that others, when they see people from that region or that area, assume is their life, which may or may not be. And so I like to share with you a video of my father as he talks about his Cajun or Acadian roots that led him to Southern Louisiana as well.
I'm happy today to be bringing my daughter and my granddaughter to a place that we call Vermilionville. Vermilionville is what Lafayette was called before it became Lafayette, the early settlement that took place, and this is a replica of how life was when Lafayette was first settled. Means a lot to me because of the fact that my father always told me that his family came down the Vermilion River and helped to settle this area. My father, Arthur Richard, his father rather, my grandfather, we always called him T-Pop. Lee Fraud was his nickname, but he was Arthur Richard Sr. And the family came down from Nova Scotia on my father's side. And of course, our heritage goes back to Ireland, to England. And my mother's side of the family came from West Africa. Her family is settled in the area of the Felicianas. She came here to go to school, high school, and that's how she met my father. And as a result of that, here I am. Lafayette means a lot to me because my parents lived here all of their lives. And it's just a wonderful, family-oriented place in which to live.
Thanks, Dad. So history also gives us the ability to be good citizens. It gives us the information that we need to understand where we are, our place in the world, our place in this moment, and how we can better our communities or not, how we can change for the better and move progressively forward. So if you don't know where you've come from or where your community has come from because it's too hard or too difficult to even think about what that looks like, you're doing your community a disservice, because how will you vote on the things that make the most sense? How will you lobby with your elected officials to ensure that all of the members of your community are at home and feel taken care of and represented? How will you carry out your civic duty if you don't even know the history of where you are? And that's one of the reasons why throughout school we're mandated to take American history or US history. Many of us have to take world history so that we understand where we are within the world. Others of us have to take history for the specific state or location that we are in so that we better understand where we are in the world. Unfortunately, some of that history that we've learned throughout our lives has not been as full as it needed to be. And so in order for us to really understand our place in our communities and in our nation, we have to read and do some extra study. And so one of the classes that I offer through the Operation Growth Institute is on Black history. And the reason why I do that is because I believe that Black history is also American history and that they're inextricably tied, just like Native American history is inextricably tied to American history. There's no way that you can talk about Christopher Columbus and the founding of this country without talking about the people who were already here, that were met here, and what happened as colonization occurred in this country. And in the same way, you can't really talk about the United States without talking about the fact that so many people were brought across the Atlantic to the New World, North and South America, to work. And what that did from a population perspective to bring people from the African continent, countries, nations throughout Africa to the United States, to various colonies without interpreters or people to support them and help them to be successful, and what that looked like. So in order for us to have a holistic ability to be able to legislate, to be able to be good citizens of the world that we live in, it's extremely important that we know our history. And so I'm going to play a snippet of the course that I teach and encourage you to participate in that course every month, because we offer Black history every month so that more and more of us can understand what that history is and how it informs our citizenship. Join the Operation Growth Institute this month and every month for Black History Every Month, the history of Black people in America, 1619 to 2021. Receive the Black history education you did not receive in school. Each year during Black History Month, we try to cram 400 plus years of history in 1-hour programs, highlighting the accomplishments of a few without providing the proper context. So join us for an informative overview that you can use to build your knowledge of the history of Black people in America. This class is open to all. And finally, our history is intertwined. It's intertwined with all that we know about our history based on our communities or what we perceive as our race. I don't buy into the theory of race, but it's based on that, but it's also based on all of the other people that were a part of our history. So in Southern Louisiana in particular, there's so many nations that came in and colonized this area in Louisiana. There's so many groups that lived in this area in Louisiana. So to look at it and say, oh, there's this huge French influence and nothing else is just false. There's Spanish influence, there's French influence, there's Native American influence, there's all kinds of influences from all over the continent of Africa because of the people who were brought there. And their influences from other states, because Louisiana and New Orleans was a huge hub for the slave trade. And when we switched from doing more cotton or planting more cotton as an industry across America, we moved to sugar plantations, which were largely in the South and were planted by Black folks who were brought either from other states or brought from the Caribbean, where they had already started to do that work, to New Orleans and sold off to actually create those sugar plantations. And so you can't talk about any place in my home of Southern Louisiana and just have a conversation about one group or one race or one culture, because they're all intertwined in what became Southern Louisiana and the wonderful food and the beautiful hospitality and the products that are created down there that people love and are drawn to. And so overall, I hope you can see how important history is to creating this context of our lives and how important it is to understand all of the histories, or begin to, it takes a lot of work, begin to understand all of the histories from the place where you are, so that you know why people act the way they do and why things are set up the way that they are. Positively, negatively, you can be a better citizen when you understand that all of our histories are intertwined inextricably, won't be untwined. It's just not going to happen. And so we are just thrilled that you've joined us again this week for Operation Growth. We hope that you will join us next week as we talk about love and Valentine's Day. My husband will be here, so I'm thrilled to share that episode with you. We've actually already taped it. And so hopefully you will enjoy our look into one of my favorite months of the year, not just because it's Black History Month, but because it's also Valentine's Day, which I call Love Month. And we'll dive into what love is. Is love really just something that we focus on Valentine's Day, or is it something that is more? And so you'll have the male and female perspective next week on Operation Growth. And with that, active personal development is a way of life. I asked God to grow, and he said, here it is. And I laugh quite often as I see the growth that is placed before me. So through this show and through all the work that I do, I hope that my growth has helped you. This is Brandi Richard Thompson signing off for now. I'll see you next Sunday on Operation Growth. We'd love to hear from you. Let us know if you have an Operation Growth moment that you would like us to feature right here on the Operation Growth Show. Use hashtag Operation Growth and tag us at Brandi Richard Thompson or at Operation Growth. We get stories from all over the place, and we would love to hear from you. Join us next week on Operation Growth with special guest Kerwin Thompson, the leading man who has been featured recently on HBO's South Side. We will be talking about love is with yours truly, his wife, Brandi Richard Thompson. The Operation Growth Show is looking for guests just like you. So if you're interested in sharing your expertise, or you're interested in sharing your product or service right here on the Operation Growth Show, let us know. We'd love to work with you. Operation Growth is a book that I wrote about my life and about the hero's journey that I felt like I was on. And after watching Eat, Pray, Love and some of these other stories about women overcoming challenges and being able to travel all over the world, figure out what they wanted to have in their lives, and really just try different things, I thought about what I had already done in my life and realized that I had overcome so many different challenges to get to where I was. And I didn't have to travel all over the world to overcome them. Sometimes African American women in particular, Black girls with tons of magic, do magical things every day. And I wanted to be able to highlight the actual process, the funny process, the tearful process that it took to get from really not having a voice to fully embracing my own voice. It's really important for people to know that I'm not there yet. I'm still in the process of growing, but I'm working on it, and I work on it every day, and I'm way better today than I was 10 years ago, 5 years ago, last year. I meditate, I pray, I spend time getting to know myself, taking care of myself. I understand that as African American people, and as Black women in particular, we are going to continue to have trauma. Someone's going to get shot. Something's going to go on at work. You're going to experience racism. You're going to experience sexual trauma and violence. And I talk about all of these things in the book, but because those things happen, that doesn't mean you have to be leveled. You can still rise, and you can still be happy, and you can still find joy, and you can still smile, and you can still have wonderful women come and sit at a table with you and talk about all those things and laugh. That is life, and that's living, and that's what Operation Growth is all about.